Since Blackmagic announced the 12K PYXIS, there's been a lot of chatter online about what camera is this and that. And I do want to primarily say that the only main difference between these two cameras, the PYXIS 12K and the 6K version, is the sensor. Now, I think what a lot of people are also not going to know is they associate the 12K with being the bigger sensor because it's a higher resolution, but that is not necessarily the case. Is this really worth 2,000 extra? So in this video today, we're actually going to go into the sensor and really determine what is the main differences between those two cameras and which one is ultimately better. And I'm going to be doing this by taking you through 3 different key points that I think you need to know about the sensors. One is the sensor sizes. The next one is the shooting modes. What are you going to get when you are filming in open gate, anamorphic, or whatever? And the last thing is the frame rates. We're primarily going to be looking at this thing so that we make a very informed conversation about these two cameras. So the first thing that I want us to discuss is what is the hype about this sensor, this RGBW sensor that Blackmagic has installed in the 12K and not in the 6K. The RGBW sensor means that in a regular sensor where you have the red, green, and blue pixels, this sensor also includes a white pixel. So you have W for the white. What that means is that in a typical one, like the one that you would have, each pixel has a color filter that limits the light that it captures. And what it means is that the white pixels don't have a color filtration, which means that they let in more light. And in that case, this increases the overall sensitivity and sort of reduces noise in low light conditions. Now, what I can tell you is that more light means you get a better dynamic range, which is why you get the 16 stops in the 12K sensor as opposed to the 13 in the 6K. And it also means that you have an improved image quality overall. Now, this might be quite subjective, I found, because once again, I think if you put an image of both sensors side by side and ask people to choose, give that image to a proper colorist, to someone who just has an idea of what they're supposed to do, and I don't think a lot of people are going to be able to tell the difference, which begs the question, what exactly is improved image quality? It's subjective. This is good because in some cases, if you have a very huge dynamic range in your frame or whatever it is you're filming, the 12K sensor is going to do well. The next part about this is the science that goes into this thing. The new RGB sensor processes image differently. This is done by a software that intelligently combines data from both the RGB and the white pixels. And this is something that the sensor in the 6K doesn't have. This just results in a better color reproduction, which once again is a mathematical equation, which makes sense as to why this would be better just because of the addition of the white pixels that are non-filtered. Another thing to know about this new sensor is that the design is more efficient. And what do I mean by that? Shout out to my subscriber who actually pointed this out to me, and I did the research on that. Because of the symmetrical layout of the 12K sensor, when you downscale from 12K to 8K or 4K, you maintain a 1x crop factor, which means that the uniformity simplifies your filming. So basically, you don't have to worry about what size of the sensor you're going to be using in whatever filming mode because it is uniform due to the symmetric layout. So basically, overall, why is this sensor an improved version of what was in the 6K? You have a better low light performance, you get higher dynamic range for more details in your shadows and your highlights, and you get a consistent, flexible performance across various resolutions without the hassle of changing the crop factor. Now that we've established what this new sensor is all about, let's talk about the sensor size differences between the two of them and what you probably don't know. Because I think a lot of people actually think the 12K sensor is bigger than the 6K sensor, but you would be wrong. Actually, the PYXIS 6K uses a full frame sensor at about 36mm times 24mm in size, and the PYXIS 12K LF sensor has an effective sensor size of 35.64 times 23.32mm, which in essence means that it is slightly smaller than the sensor in the PYXIS 6K. I'm going to say that again. The sensor in the 12K version of this camera is slightly smaller than that of the 6K. What does this mean? The implication of this is that the 6K marginally larger sensor can give you a bit shallow depth of field and a slightly wider field of view for the same focal length. If you put a 50mm on the 6K sensor and put that on the 12K sensor, you might find that you will get a slighter, just a marginally wider field of view on the 6K sensor because it is slightly larger than that of the 12K. Now, that is something that a lot of people are not going to tell you about, but I will. Now, with that being said, the 12K sensor is still designed for efficiency. So I would say that overall, for the everyday user, the difference in the sensor size is very minimal compared to the benefits of the 12K when we're looking at resolution, dynamic range, and flexibility. Let's do a breakdown of the shooting modes and the frame rates. On the PYXIS 12K, you can do 12K 3x2 open gate up to 40 frames per second. And what this means is that you get the highest detail and flexibility if you need to crop in post, or you plan to future-proof your work, or you actually have to do like a lot of VFX. Now, the downside of this is that the files are going to be very large. So in 12K as well, this camera can do 16:9, 17:9, 2:4:1, and 6:5. And it can do all of this in multiple variations from up to 45 to 60 frames per second. Now, this means that you can get a lot of the cinematic aspect ratios while you keep the quality of the entire sensor. Now, this is especially great for people who do not want to worry about cropping into the sensor when they are going between different frame rates and resolutions. Also, you can come down to 9K, 8K, and 4K modes, and this modes just sort of lets you record at lower resolutions while still capturing the full sensor data without any crop. Now, what this means is that you get smaller file sizes, you get faster frame rates, and you get easier post-production workflow. This flexibility is very, very good for people if you always don't need the full 12K modes, which in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people are not going to be using the 12K every single time. Once again, those files are extremely huge. Now, let's bring it to the PYXIS 6K. At this point, we can call it the 6K OG. The 6K sensor has 6K in open gate 3x2 with multiple aspect ratios. For example, you can do 6K in open gate. You could also do that in CinemaScope, and you have frame rates up to 60 frames per second. This is good, but this is also one of the downsides of this camera is that it locks you into 6K if you want to use the entire size of the sensor. If you want to do any other modes, you now have to start cropping in, which is where the 12K sensor doesn't do that. This is not to say that the sensor is bad or it's worse or anything like that. It just means that the dynamic range and the image quality are still very solid, but you have less flexibility for down resing without cropping in on the sensor. That's the only thing. Now, this can also do 120 frames, but in HD version, in 1080p. It's a lower resolution. The file sizes will make it easier for you to work with in post-production. And this also might be practical for the everyday user who is just looking for a quick turnaround. What is the implication of the sensor sizes for the everyday user? I'm talking about the everyday casual user here. Flexibility. The 12K sensor is going to give you multiple resolution options that you can work with without the hassle of cropping. Now, this is a major benefit if you want to experiment with like different looks, or you plan to future-proof the work that you're doing without being locked into one mode. The second thing is the storage and workflow. Now, recording in 12K will naturally produce large extensive files, meaning that you will have to spend more on storage and you might need a more robust workflow in some ways. But if you downres to 8K or 4K, you will get smaller file sizes, better frame rates, and good editing files that you can work with. Now, a lot of people think that this is going to help in terms of skin tones and like the rich colors and overall image quality. But once again, I still think that this is a very subjective argument for this sensor because, you know, if I'm watching on a phone and you're watching on a screen, on a TV screen, you know, how do you really tell the difference in there? And the last thing is the simplicity of future-proofing your work. The 6K still offers excellent quality, but the 12K just provides a future-proof solution with consistent sensor performance all across different resolutions. If you don't want to worry about like crop factors of this and everything and all of that, the 12K sensor is the way to go. So basically, if we're going to really distill this down, is the 12K sensor better? Yes, And I want you to think of it this way. This is where a lot of people have been commenting. Theoretically, the 6K sensor has a slower readout than that on the 12K. So once again, to just wrap it up, I think that beyond the sensor, the two cameras share a lot of similarities in terms of what they can offer. But the main question here is it worth the extra $2,000 for that new RGBW sensor? And I think so. One, you're looking at better readout speeds, you're looking at high frame rate capabilities, you're looking at a smoother performance in fast-paced shooting scenarios, you're looking at consistent performance across multiple resolutions without the hassle of a crop factor, which makes switching between resolutions simpler and more efficient. You're also looking at an overall image quality boost that is noticeable when you start to push the image in post-production because there's less noise. So ultimately, I feel like the 12K sensor might be the ultimate camera for the mid-level professional, or like the, you know, the regular person who's like just working on normal films and everything, because it offers all these incredible features. I don't know what Blackmagic is like. What is the plan here? What is this disruption coming into the market? I'll tell you one thing though, is I'm now willing to switch to DaVinci Resolve just because I feel like there's a huge chance that I will be getting the PYXIS 12K. And that's huge. That is huge coming from me, people. I'm telling you. Yeah.